Welcome to another deep dive into early Christian thought. We're tackling Augustine this time. You probably know him as a big name in theology, but
So yeah, huge.
did you know that he left behind this unfinished work where he's like wrestling with the book of Genesis?
Yeah. The literal interpretation of Genesis. It's unfinished, but
Unfinished.
gives us this amazing look into how he was thinking about creation. I mean, this is Augustine, right?
Yeah.
One of the most important thinkers in Christian history.
It's dense. It's dense stuff, but we're going to break it down. Promise it's worth it. We'll uncover his interpretations of Genesis 1, but also like his methods, what he struggled with, what it tells us about how he saw the world.
And I think what you'll see is that even though he was writing like over 1,500 years ago, what he's talking about is still relevant today to how we understand the world.
Totally. Right away, Augustine kind of lays out how he's going to approach this. And it's surprising because he's really cautious. Like, he's all about asking questions, not like making big pronouncements about how creation happened.
That's right. He was very aware of how Scripture could be misused, especially by groups he considered heretics. So he's careful to ground himself in the Catholic faith first, before he even jumps into Genesis. It's like he's saying, okay, here's where I'm starting from, so I'm being orthodox.
Yeah. It's like he's setting up a framework, making sure that his interpretations are like built on something solid. Then he goes on to lay out these 4 ways of reading Genesis.
Yeah, and this is so important to understanding Augustine. He doesn't just take it literally historically, but, he looks at allegorical symbolism, connections to the New Testament, and even what's called etiology, like looking at the reasons why things are described the way they are.
So it's not just one right way to read Genesis, it's layers.
Exactly. Layers of meaning.
So, okay, with that in mind, he tackles that very first verse in the beginning. It seems straightforward enough, but
Oh, of course not.
Augustine, of course, turns it into this philosophical puzzle.
Right. He asks, what does in the beginning actually mean? Is it the very beginning of time itself? Or is it the beginning of God's wisdom, the Word, which, he links later to Christ?
Whoa. So he's already connecting creation to Jesus. Okay, and then he throws in this other head scratcher. He's like, were angels created before the physical universe? So now we're not just talking about when it began, but the order. Like what came first?
And it gets even wilder because this leads him to ask, how does time even work? Like if there was a before, does that mean time existed before the universe? It makes you question what beginning even means.
It really stretches your mind. It's no wonder he never finished this work, right? He's dealing with questions that still blow people's minds today.
I know, right? But the thing is, he doesn't shy away from the hard questions. He dives right in, and he wants us to grapple with them too. He's showing us that it's okay to not have all the answers.
It's so refreshing. Okay, so we've got a beginning that might not be the real beginning. Then he moves on to the next part. Heaven and earth seems clear-cut, right?
Oh, you know Augustine. He loves to explore multiple possibilities. So he's like, does this mean everything that exists, like the totality of creation, or is it about separation? The spiritual realm of heaven versus the physical earth.
And then he gets to this really wild idea
Yeah.
that maybe it's talking about primordial matter, like the stuff that existed before God shaped it into the world. He even brings in Wisdom 11.19, where it says, you made the world from formless matter.
Yeah, and that opens up the idea of God as this cosmic sculptor, working with something that already exists, not just creating from absolutely nothing, which has huge implications for how you understand creation.
It's like, what was that formless matter?
Over there.
So many questions. Okay, so we've got a beginning that's not a beginning. Heaven and earth, that might be something totally different. What's next on Augustine's crazy train ride through Genesis?
Well, we get to that classic image. The very next line, and darkness was over the abyss. Primordial darkness before creation.
So he probably just takes that literally, right? Darkness like a physical thing.
He does something much more interesting. He doesn't see darkness as a thing itself. He describes it as the absence of light.
Oh, that's smart. So God didn't create darkness. It's just what happens when there's no light.
Right. And then he goes on to give these 3 different interpretations of light. The physical light we see, the light of perception in our minds, and like this higher light of reason and contemplation.
Whoa, so light suddenly means like a million things. It goes way beyond the physical world.
Absolutely. Augustine's showing us that there's all this symbolism packed into these words, that we got to look beyond the surface.
It's like he's saying, be curious, ask questions, explore different interpretations. So we've got light that might not be light. What other surprises are in store?
Well, he focuses on how God speaks in the creation account. All those God said
Mhm.
phrases.
Right, like it's pretty simple. But I bet Augustine finds something that to unpack.
Of course. He wants us to think about how God's speech is different from ours. He says it's not physical like our speech. It's an act of pure will, a command.
So not like God is literally saying words, but more like willing things into being.
Yeah. And he supports this by going to John 1:2, where he says, all things were made through him, the Word, and without him, nothing was made.
Ah, so he's weaving in the New Testament, saying creation is an act of the divine word, which he links to Christ, of course.
So smart, right? He's not just explaining what was created, but the how. And that reveals something about God.
This is already so much deeper than just like a retelling of Genesis. It's like we're getting into Augustine's mind.
And we're just getting started. Next time, we'll dive into how he tackles the creation of day and night, and it's going to get really wild. Okay, so we were talking about how God speaks this whole, like, willing things into being.
Yeah, through the word.
Right, exactly.
Oh,
And from there, the creation account goes on to day and night. And Augustine, right away, he sees a bit of a problem.
I was thinking about that actually. How can you have days before the sun exists? Because, like, isn't a day measured by the sun?
Right. So he's like, maybe we shouldn't take day and night literally here.
So they're like symbolic then. What would they even represent?
He has a couple of interesting ideas. One is that they symbolize things appearing and disappearing.
So, like, things coming into being and then fading away.
Exactly. Or, he says, it could be about the shift from formlessness to form, like God shaping that primordial matter.
Okay, I'm starting to get how Augustine's brain works, always digging for that deeper meaning.
Oh yeah, he doesn't stop there.
Yeah.
He also suggests that day and night could represent the difference between, like, knowing something clearly and then having that clarity fade.
Deep. So it's not just about literal time, but like our understanding.
Yeah, like a metaphor for how humans understand things.
Makes you think.
Yeah.
So we move on, right?
Yeah, to the firmament.
Okay, so for folks who don't know, the firmament is often translated as like a vault or a dome.
Right, and this is where ancient cosmology gets really interesting. Remember how people used to picture the sky like a
Ah.
solid dome?
Yeah, separating the waters above from the waters below. Sounds kind of crazy now, but
It does. But Augustine, he doesn't dismiss it completely. He actually thinks about whether it could symbolize a separation between the spiritual and physical realms.
okay, I'm seeing it. Heaven above, earth below.
Exactly. Or he thinks maybe the firmament represents how the heavens are unchanging while the earth is always in flux.
So much depth to just describing the sky.
Here, it's Augustine for you, always connecting things. And all throughout this, he keeps coming back to this phrase, and God saw that it was good.
Yeah, it shows up all over Genesis 1, like this repeating chorus.
And Augustine notices that its placement changes throughout the chapter. He uses this to argue that while we might read creation as a step-by-step process, God's creation was actually instantaneous.
Hold up. Instantaneous. That's a big claim. How does he back that up?
He's basically saying that the text isn't meant to be a strict timeline. It's conveying a deeper truth about God's power. God's creative act wasn't piecemeal. It was singular and complete.
I see. So it's like we humans, with our limited view of time, we need things broken down into steps, even though from God's perspective, it all happened at once.
Yeah, mind-blowing, right? Augustine is pushing us to think beyond our linear time-bound of perspective.
This is getting heavy. Okay, so creation happened in an instant, even though it's presented in stages. Does Augustine comment on the order of creation at all?
He does. When God makes plants, Augustine notices that they're commanded to reproduce, each bearing seed like it. That's not said about the light or sky or earth.
Okay, so why single out plants?
Augustine links it to how plants exist. They sprout, grow, die, and regenerate. It's an observation about how different parts of creation have their own unique purposes.
Like God tailored his creative act to each thing he made.
Exactly. Speaking of unique properties, Augustine also gets stuck on the sun and moon being created after there are already days, like we talked about. How can you have days before the sun?
Right, so he's back to that. What does he say about it this time?
Well, he thinks maybe it's for our sake. Our human perception of time is based on day and night, so the text presents it that way, even though it might not have literally happened like that. Or, he says, maybe those early days are about something different altogether, like God separating forms within that primordial matter.
So those first days are about God bringing order out of chaos, not literal 24 hours.
Could be. And then Augustine hits a passage that really confuses him. It's the idea that birds come out of water.
Wait, what? Birds from water? How does that even...
Yeah, that's what the text says. And Augustine is understandably confused. plenty of birds. They live nowhere near water.
So how does he explain that?
He gets pretty creative.
Yeah.
He proposes that the water here isn't literal water. He's talking about the air, specifically the lower, thicker air.
The atmosphere. Okay, what makes him think that?
Well, he points to things like dew and clouds, right? And how birds can only fly so high before the air is too thin.
Right, so he's using what he knows about the world to inform how he reads the text.
Exactly. And he even brings up Mount Olympus. How its peak is above the clouds. He uses that as an example of how the air changes at different altitudes.
So we're getting science mixed in with theology now.
Augustine was a pretty sharp guy. And it's a good reminder for all of us, right? The most literal reading of a text might not be the most insightful.
Okay, I'll keep that in mind. So we've got birds coming from the water of the air. What else does Augustine have to say about the creatures God makes?
He notices something interesting about how God talks about reproduction. For animals, he blesses them to increase and multiply. But he doesn't say that about plants.
So why the difference? Plants reproduce too.
Augustine thinks it's because animals have senses,
Yeah.
a kind of awareness that plants don't. So in a way, they're closer to humans.
So a hierarchy. Animals higher than plants because they can perceive the world.
That's his idea. And he also points at a tiny change in God's wording. For fish, it's increase and multiply, a direct command. But for birds, it's let the flying creatures multiply.
It seems like such a small difference. Why does it matter to Augustine?
He sees it as possibly hinting at the difference between human reason and animal instinct. We can think things through, make choices. Animals, they just act on instinct, right?
So much depth in just a few words. Augustine's like a code breaker.
He is. And finally, we get to the big one, the creation of humanity. And as you can imagine, Augustine has a lot to say about this. All centers on that one line. Let us make humankind in our image and likeness.
Okay, this is it, the big question. What does it mean to be made in God's image? That's been debated forever.
It has. But before he even gets into that, Augustine stops to think about those words. Let us make humankind. The use of us is interesting. Who's God talking to?
Yeah, it's different from all those let there be statements.
And Augustine uses this to make a point about the nature of God. He says God is talking to the Word, the Son. So right away, he's bringing in the Trinity.
Wow, we're not even to humans yet, and we're already talking about Father, Son, Holy Spirit.
Augustine wants to make it clear that creation isn't just the work of a single God. It's a Trinitarian act.
Okay, so the Trinity's involved. But what about that phrase, image and likeness? Why both?
Good question. Augustine says likeness means something more than just looking like something. It's about sharing in God's essence.
I'm going to need an example, because this is getting abstract.
Okay, think of chastity. A person can be chaste, but chastity itself is bigger than just one person, right? It's the source of chastity.
I see. So being like, God isn't just acting like him, but having something of his essence in us.
Exactly. And Augustine goes on to suggest that the Son, being the perfect image of the Father, is like the source of all likeness in creation. It's through him that we get this likeness.
This is deep theological stuff. We're talking about how God relates to creation, what makes us human.
Yeah, we're going deep. And Augustine even gets into whether our bodies can be like God. He points out that humans stand upright while animals don't.
So our posture is like a reflection of God.
It's an idea. He's not saying we literally look like God, of course, but maybe our physical form says something about our spiritual connection to him.
Okay, another layer added on to image and likeness. And here's the thing. This whole section on likeness, he actually added it in later. Really? So he revised his thinking on this.
He did. In that later edition, he's very clear that humans are made in the image of the entire Trinity, not just one part of it.
So it's all three, Father, Son, Spirit, not just one of them.
Right. And he uses the text to support this. Genesis 1.27 says his, referring back to our for the previous verse, like it's hinting at the three in one.
Nice catch. So it's not just Augustine's opinion. He's finding it in the text.
He also brings in James 3.9, where it talks about humans being made in God's likeness. Augustine takes that to mean that this likeness isn't something we achieve later. It's there from the start.
So we're born with it, not something we earn.
That's the idea. As part of our nature, this capacity for connection with God, to reflect his love.
That's a powerful thought. It's not about proving ourselves worthy. It's about realizing what's already there.
And Augustine is showing us how this isn't just some feel-good idea. It's rooted in Genesis. He's unpacking the language, the grammar, to reveal this truth about us.
Augustine wasn't messing around. He really paid attention to every detail.
He was a serious scholar. Okay, so we've got humans made in the image of the Trinity.
Mm.
What else does Augustine notice about this creation of humanity?
Well, humans are created right after the land animals, right? So we're kind of lumped in with them.
He's not trying to put us down or anything. He's actually emphasizing that both humans and animals are creatures of the earth. We share that common origin. We're part of the natural world.
Oh, so it's about acknowledging that connection.
Exactly. But of course, there is a crucial difference. Only humans are made in God's image. That sets us apart.
So we're connected to the earth, but also stand above it. It's kind of a paradox.
Augustine loves a good paradox.
Yeah.
We're creatures of dust, but we also have this divine spark. That's the human condition, right?
Okay, so we've got humans, God's image, connection to the animals. Anything else about this sixth day of creation?
Well, Augustine points out that the text doesn't say God named the land animals. He names everything else: light, darkness, sky, sea, but not the animals.
Interesting. Why do you think that is?
He doesn't have a definite answer. He suggests that maybe it was just too much, too many species, impossible to name them all.
Seems practical enough. But I wouldn't put it past Augustine to find some deeper meaning there, too.
Maybe he's saying that human language can't fully capture the diversity of creation. Like our words and categories, they fall short when we're talking about God's creativity.
So we can try to understand, but there's always going to be a mystery.
Exactly. We can name things, but the wonder of creation, it always goes beyond our grasp.
I like that. There's always more to learn. Well, this has been quite a journey through just the first chapter of Genesis. We've really been challenged to rethink some basic ideas.
And Augustine does it all with such brilliance. He was a sharp mind, deeply spiritual too.
And the thing is, we've only scratched the surface. His work goes so much deeper, and it's unfinished, which makes you wonder what else he would have come up with.
Before we move on, what's sticking with you most so far? What surprised you about Augustine's interpretation of Genesis?
You know, it's funny. I keep coming back to that Sabbath thing, like seeing it as a way of being, not just a day.
It really is the core of Augustine's whole view, I think.
Yeah.
We're not just meant to work and produce and be busy all the time. We're also meant to find that rest, that connection with something bigger.
So it's not about what we accomplish, but how we connect with God. Sounds kind of radical even now.
He was ahead of his time in a lot of ways. And the thing is, he doesn't give us the how-to manual,
Yeah.
like here are the steps to live out the Sabbath. It's unfinished, which is fitting.
So he's pointing us in a direction, but we got to figure out the path ourselves.
That's Augustine for you. Always making us think, never just handing us answers. He wants us to wrestle with these ideas.
I like that. It's not a rule book. It's an invitation to explore.
And I think that's why people still find him relevant. He's not stuck in the past. He's speaking to something timeless.
It's been quite a journey. Time, creation, humanity, God. We've covered a lot of ground, and it's just one chapter of Genesis.
And he does it with such depth, right? You could tell he thought about every word.
It's made me see the creation story in a whole new light. It's not just a list of events. It's about so much more.
It's about who we are, how we fit into the universe, what our relationship is to God. It's a story that's still unfolding, and we're all part of it.
I love that idea. And it's like what Augustine says, that Genesis shows us the connection between God, humans, and the cosmos. It's all woven together.
So keep exploring, keep asking questions. See where your own reading of Genesis takes you. Don't be afraid to dig deep.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into Augustine. Until next time, keep searching for those deeper layers of meaning. They're out there waiting to be discovered.